Video title == The Thunderbolt of Destiny. The Rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, Part 1 hook 000-045, December 2nd, 1805. The cold, biting mist of a Moravian morning clings to the frozen ground near the town of Austerlitz. Two emperors, the Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of Austria, look down from the Pratzen Heights, confident that they have finally trapped the Corsican ogre. Their combined armies outnumber the French. Their position is dominant. They believe the era of French expansion is about to end in a bloodbath of snow and iron. But down in the valley, through the swirling fog, a single man sits atop a white horse. He is not afraid. He is waiting. Napoleon Bonaparte has intentionally weakened his right flank, dangling a lure that the Allies cannot resist. As the Austro-Russian forces pour down the heights to seize the bait, the sun suddenly breaks through the clouds, the legendary son of Austerlitz. In that moment, Napoleon signals his hidden reserves. With a thunderous roar of Vive l'Empereur, the French center surges upward, slicing the Allied army in two. In a single afternoon, the map of Europe is torn to shreds. Thousands of fleeing soldiers drown in the icy waters of the Sachin Ponds as French artillery shatters the ice beneath their feet. This was not just a battle. It was a masterpiece of slaughter and strategy. But how did an impoverished boy from a backwater island who spoke French with a thick, ridiculed accent rise to become the master of the world? This is not just history. This is the story of a man who became a god of war. Introduction 045-230. At the tail end of the 18th century, the world was a powder keg. The Enlightenment had sparked a fire in the minds of men, and in 1789, that fire consumed the French monarchy. The French Revolution didn't just kill a king, it challenged the very foundations of human society. It promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it delivered the guillotine and the reign of terror. As Paris drowned in blood, the monarchies of Europe, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, saw an opportunity to crush the revolutionary spirit before it could spread. France was a nation under siege, surrounded by enemies on every border and torn apart by internal civil war. The revolution was a monster that ate its own children, a chaotic vacuum where the old rules of nobility and birthright no longer applied. In this world of chaos, talent was the only currency that mattered, and no one possessed more talent or more terrifying ambition than Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a creature of the artillery, a man of mathematics, trajectory, and cold, hard logic. While others argued about philosophy in the salons of Paris, Napoleon studied the terrain of the battlefield. To understand Napoleon is to understand the birth of the modern world. He would rewrite the laws of nations, dismantle the Holy Roman Empire, and establish a meritocracy that allowed a common soldier to carry a marshal's baton in his knapsack. He was a visionary who built the Arc de Triomphe and the Napoleonic Code, but he was also a tyrant who sacrificed millions of lives on the altar of his own ego. He was a man of contradictions, a liberator who crowned himself emperor, a romantic who loved Josephine with a desperate passion, yet abandoned her for political gain. In this first part of our journey, we trace his meteoric rise, from the rugged hills of Corsica to the burning sands of Egypt, and finally to the halls of power in Paris, where he would seize the reins of a nation and begin a march that would not stop until he had reached the gates of Moscow. The stage is set. The cannons are loaded. The era of Napoleon has begun. Section 1. The Corsican Outsider. A boy born of resistance. To understand the fire that drove Napoleon, one must look to the rugged, sun-drenched island of Corsica. Born on August 15, 1769, in the town of Ajaccio, Napoleon Bonaparte was not born French. Just 1 year before his birth, the Republic of Genoa had sold the island to France. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a minor nobleman who had fought for Corsican independence alongside the legendary patriot Pasquale Paoli. When the resistance collapsed, Carlo chose to collaborate with the French to secure a future for his children, a move the young Napoleon would initially view as a betrayal. Napoleon grew up in a house filled with the scent of wild maquis and the fierce traditions of the vendetta. He was the second of 8 surviving children, raised by a mother, Letizia, whose toughness he would praise for the rest of his life. At the age of 9, the little Corsican was sent to the military school at Brienne-le-Chateau in mainland France. It was a brutal transition. He was a skinny, brooding boy with a thick Italian Corsican accent, and his classmates, sons of the wealthy French aristocracy, marked him mercilessly. They called him an outsider, a charity case of the king. Napoleon's response was to retreat into a world of books. He devoured the works of Plutarch, Caesar, and Alexander the Great. He excelled in mathematics and geography, subjects where logic reigned supreme. One famous legend tells of a massive winter snowball fight at the school where Napoleon organized his classmates into opposing armies, constructing elaborate snow ramparts and trenches. Even as a child, he was thinking in terms of fortifications and flanking maneuvers. In 1784, he was accepted into the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. He completed the 2-year course in just 1 year, becoming the first Corsican to graduate as an artillery officer. Why artillery? Because in the 18th century, the infantry and cavalry were reserved for the high-born nobility with the money to buy commissions. The artillery, however, required brains. It required a mastery of physics and geometry. Napoleon was an officer of the New France before the revolution even began. When the Bastille fell in 1789, Napoleon was a young lieutenant stationed in Valence. While many of his fellow officers fled the country or stayed loyal to the king, Napoleon saw the revolution as a ladder. He returned to Corsica, hoping to lead a local uprising, but he soon clashed with his former hero, Pasquale Paoli. The Buonapartes were forced to flee their homeland in 1793, narrowly escaping with their lives as their house was ransacked. Napoleon arrived in France as a refugee, a man without a country, but with a burning desire to prove his worth to the republic that had adopted him. He was 24 years old, penniless, and hungry for glory. Section 2. The whiff of grape shot, Toulon, and the rise of the Jacobin general in the summer of 1793, the French Republic was on the verge of collapse. The port city of Toulon, the crown jewel of the French Mediterranean fleet, had revolted against the revolutionary government and invited the British and Spanish navies into its harbor. This was an existential threat. If Toulon remained in British hands, the southern front of France would be wide open to invasion. The Republican army sent to retake the city was led by incompetent political appointees. When the commander of the artillery was wounded, a young Captain Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to replace him, largely thanks to the patronage of his fellow Corsican, Antoine Salisti. Napoleon arrived at the siege and was horrified by the tactical stupidity he witnessed. He immediately identified the key to the city, a fortification called Fort Elegalet. He realized that if he could place his cannons there, he could rain fire down on the British fleet and force them to evacuate. It took weeks of arguing with superior officers, but Napoleon finally got his way. He worked tirelessly, sleeping on the ground beside his guns. He renamed one of his batteries the Battery of Men Without Fear to inspire his troops. On the night of December 17th, amidst a torrential rainstorm, Napoleon led the final assault on the heights. He was stabbed in the thigh by a British bayonet, his first of many wounds, but the fort was taken. The British fleet, seeing their position was untenable, weighed anchor and fled, burning the French ships they couldn't take with them. Napoleon was promoted from captain to brigadier general at the age of 24. However, his rise was nearly cut short. Napoleon had aligned himself with the radical Jacobins, specifically Augustin Robespierre, the brother of the architect of the Terror. When Maximilien Robespierre was sent to the guillotine in 1794, Napoleon was arrested and imprisoned, suspected of being a traitor. For a moment, it seemed the Corsican would lose his head before his career had truly begun. But his technical expertise was too valuable to waste. He was released, though he found himself in Paris without a command, wandering the streets in a threadbare coat. Destiny knocked again in October 1795. A royalist mob of over 30,000 people rose up in Paris to overthrow the new government, the Directory. The government turned to Paul Barras, who remembered the hero of Toulon. Barras gave Napoleon command of the defense. Napoleon did not hesitate. He ordered a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize 40 cannons from a nearby park and bring them to the heart of the city. As the mob surged toward the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He opened fire with cannons at point-blank range in the narrow streets. This was the whiff of grape shot. Hundreds were mowed down, and the rebellion vanished in a cloud of smoke. Napoleon had saved the Republic, and in return, the Republic gave him the command he had always dreamed of, the Army of Italy. Section 3, the Italian Whirlwind. Creating the legend when Napoleon arrived in Nice in March 1796 to take command of the Army of Italy, he found a disaster. His soldiers were barefoot, starving, and mutinous. His generals, men like Massena and Augereau, were older, more experienced, and openly contemptuous of the puny 26-year-old commander. Napoleon didn't argue with them. He simply looked them in the eye and took control. He issued his first famous proclamation: "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." What followed was one of the most brilliant military campaigns in human history. In just 12 months, Napoleon defeated 5 superior Austrian armies. He didn't play by the old rules of gentlemanly warfare. He moved with a speed that defied belief, striking his enemies before they even knew he had crossed the mountains. He pioneered the corps system, dividing his army into self-sufficient units that could march separately and concentrate rapidly for a battle. At the Bridge of Lodi in May 1796, Napoleon personally led a charge across a narrow bridge swept by Austrian cannon fire. It was a suicidal move, but it worked. The soldiers began to call him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, out of affection for his bravery. It was after Lodi that Napoleon later remarked, "I no longer regarded myself as a simple general, but as a man called upon to decide the fate of peoples." He was not just a general, he was a master of propaganda. He started his own newspapers that were sent back to Paris, filled with glowing accounts of his victories. He sent wagons of looted Italian art, works by Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, back to the Louvre, winning the hearts of the French public. He also met and married the great love of his life during this time, Marie-Joseph Rose de Beauharnais, whom he renamed Josephine. He wrote her feverish, passionate letters from the front, even as he was dismantling the Austrian Empire. By 1797, Napoleon had pushed the Austrians back to within 80 miles of Vienna. He ignored the Directory's orders and negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio himself, effectively redrawing the map of northern Italy and ending the War of the First Coalition. He returned to Paris a superstar. The streets were packed with people chanting his name. But Napoleon knew that in Paris, glory was fleeting. He famously said, "If I remain long without doing anything, I am lost." In this great Babylon, one reputation replaces another. He needed a new project, something that would capture the imagination of the world. He turned his eyes toward the east. Section 4, the sands of Egypt, the dream of Empire Napoleon's plan for 1878 was as audacious as it was dangerous. He would invade Egypt. The goal was to strike a blow against Great Britain's trade routes to India and establish a French colony in the Middle East. The Directory, secretly glad to have the ambitious young general far away from Paris, quickly approved the expedition. Napoleon set sail with 35,000 troops and, interestingly, a commission of sciences and arts. consisting of 167 scholars, botanists, and archaeologists. He didn't just want to conquer Egypt, he wanted to uncover its secrets. The voyage was a gamble. The British Royal Navy, led by the relentless Admiral Horatio Nelson, was hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean. Napoleon narrowly avoided them and landed at Alexandria in July. The heat was suffocating, and the French soldiers, dressed in heavy wool uniforms, suffered immensely. But they marched on toward Cairo. On July 21, 1798, they encountered the Mamluks, the legendary warrior caste that had ruled Egypt for centuries, at the Battle of the Pyramids. The Mamluks were world-class cavalrymen, but they were no match for modern French tactics. Napoleon formed his infantry into massive hollow squares, with cannons at the corners. As the Mamluk horsemen charged, Napoleon pointed to the ancient monuments and uttered the immortal words, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." The Mamluk charge shattered against the French bayonets. It was a total victory, but the triumph was short-lived. Just days later, Nelson finally found the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, the British decimated the French navy, cutting Napoleon off from France. He was now a prisoner of his own conquest, never one to sit idle. Napoleon set about governing Egypt. He modernized the administration, founded the Institute of Egypt, and his scholars discovered the Rosetta Stone, the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. However, the military situation grew grim. He marched into Syria to preempt an Ottoman invasion, but his army was halted at the siege of Acre by British-supported Turkish forces in a devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague. In 1799, Napoleon received news from France. The Republic was in chaos again, losing ground in Italy and facing internal collapse. Seeing his opportunity, he abandoned his army in Egypt, slipped past the British blockade in a small frigate, and landed in France. To the public, he wasn't a deserter. He was the savior who had returned from the exotic East to rescue the nation from the corrupt politicians of the Directory. Section 5. Seizing the reins, the coup of 18 Brumaire when Napoleon reached Paris in October 1799, the political climate was toxic. The Directory was despised, the economy was in shambles, and the threat of a royalist restoration loomed. A group of conspirators, led by the director Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes, wanted to overthrow the government and install a strongman who could provide stability. They chose Napoleon. Believing they could control him, they were wrong. The coup was set for November 9th, the 18th of Brumaire according to the revolutionary calendar. The plan was to move the two legislative houses, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients, to the Palace of St. Cloud under the pretext of a Jacobin plot. There, they would be forced to vote for a new constitution. However, the coup almost failed. On the second day, Napoleon entered the chamber of the Council of 500. He was not a natural orator. He was a man of action. He became flustered as the deputies began to shout down with the dictator and outlaw him. They swarmed him, jostling and pulling at his clothes. Napoleon, the man who had faced down Austrian cannons, nearly fainted in the heat of the political brawl. He was dragged out of the hall by his grenadiers, bleeding from a scratched face. The situation was saved by his brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the president of the council. Napoleon went out to the troops guarding the palace and told them that the deputies were being bribed by English gold and were trying to assassinate their general. In a dramatic gesture, Napoleon pointed a sword at Napoleon's heart and swore that he would kill his own brother if he ever betrayed the principles of liberty. This theater worked. The soldiers, led by Murat, marched into the hall with fixed bayonets. The deputies jumped out of the windows into the evening mist. That night, a small group of remaining legislators met and appointed 3 consuls to lead the new government: Sieyes, Roger Ducos, and Napoleon. But Napoleon quickly outmaneuvered his colleagues. He drafted the constitution of the year Roman 8, which gave the first consul, himself, nearly absolute power. When Sieyes complained, he realized too late that he had invited a lion into the house. At the age of 30, Napoleon Bonaparte was now the de facto dictator of France. He moved into the Tuileries Palace, the former home of the kings. He ended the chaos of the revolution, but he also ended its democracy. He famously declared, "Citizens, the revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over." France was no longer a republic of talkers. It was an empire in the making. The little corporal had become the first consul, and he was just getting started. Europe was watching, and soon it would be trembling. Section 6, the son of Austerlitz and the master of Europe narrator. By 1805, the fragile peace of Amiens had shattered, and the Third Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Austria, and Russia, rose to challenge the Corsican upstart. Napoleon, now emperor, realized that to secure his throne, he must strike with the speed of a thunderbolt. He pivoted his army of the ocean, renamed the Grande Armée, away from the English Channel, and marched them hundreds of miles into the heart of Germany. What followed was a masterpiece of military maneuver. At Ulm, he trapped an entire Austrian army under General Mack without a major battle, forcing their surrender through sheer operational genius. But the true test awaited on the frozen plains of Moravia. On December 2, 1801, exactly 1 year after his coronation, the Battle of Austerlitz commenced. The Battle of the Three Emperors remains Napoleon's tactical masterpiece. He deliberately weakened his right flank, tempting the Russian Tsar Alexander I and the Austrian Emperor Francis Roman II to attack. As the Allies bit the bait, thinning their center to reinforce their assault, Napoleon unleashed Marshal Soult's corps. They emerged from the morning mist, the legendary son of Austerlitz, to seize the Pratzen Heights, cutting the Allied army in half. The carnage was absolute. The Russian guard was shattered, and the remnants of the Allied force fled across frozen ponds that Napoleon's artillery reportedly shattered with cannonballs. In the aftermath, the Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year-old institution, was dissolved, replaced by the Confederation of the Rhine under Napoleon's protection. Yet, peace remained elusive. Prussia, having sat out the 1805 campaign, grew fearful of French hegemony and declared war in 1806. Napoleon's response was devastating. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the vaunted Prussian army, the legacy of Frederick the Great, was annihilated in a single day. Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph, standing at the tomb of Frederick and remarking to his marshals, "If he were alive, we would not be here." From Berlin, he issued the Continental System Decree, a desperate economic blockade intended to bring the nation of shopkeepers, Britain, to its knees. The campaign then pushed into the freezing mud of Poland. After the bloody, indecisive draw at Eylau, Napoleon finally crushed the Russians at Friedland in June 1807. This led to the famous meeting on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Ulcer. There, Napoleon and Alexander, I divided Europe between them. At this moment, Napoleon was at the absolute zenith of his power. He was the master of the continent, a king of kings who had redrawn the map of Europe, placing his brothers on the thrones of Holland, Westphalia, and Naples. But the seeds of his destruction were already being sown in the soil of the Iberian Peninsula and the icy reaches of the north. Section 7, the Spanish Ulcer and the shadow of Wagram narrator. The year 1808 marked a fateful turning point. Obsessed with enforcing his continental system, Napoleon turned his eyes toward Portugal, Britain's oldest ally. To reach Portugal, he needed passage through Spain, but his true intentions were far more ambitious. Through a series of tawdry political maneuvers at Bayonne, he forced the Spanish Bourbons to abdicate and placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Madrid. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Napoleon, the child of the Enlightenment, believed the Spanish people would welcome his rational reforms and the removal of their corrupt monarchy. Instead, he ignited a firestorm of nationalistic religious fervor. The Das de Mayo uprising in Madrid was met with brutal French repression. immortalized in the haunting paintings of Goya. But the execution of rebels only fueled the insurgency. For the first time, Napoleon faced guerrilla, the Little War. Every village became a fortress, every peasant a potential assassin. In July 1808, the world was shocked when an entire French corps surrendered to Spanish forces at Belaine. The myth of French invincibility was broken. To make matters worse, Britain saw its opportunity, landing an expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. Peninsular War would become Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer, a wound that would never heal, eventually draining France of 300,000 of her finest soldiers. While Napoleon was bogged down in Spain, Austria saw a chance for revenge. In 1809, the Fifth Coalition was formed. Napoleon had to rush back to the Danube, leaving the Spanish quagmire to his squabbling marshals. The ensuing campaign was far more difficult than those of the past. At Espernessling, Napoleon suffered his first major personal defeat on the battlefield, and he lost one of his closest friends, Marshal Lannes. Though he eventually secured a bloody victory at the Battle of Wagram, the cost was staggering. The Grande Armée was no longer the professional elite of 1805. It was becoming a mass of conscripts, and Napoleon's enemies were finally learning how to fight him. Following the victory at Wagram, Napoleon sought to solidify his dynasty, having divorced Josephine because she could not provide an heir, a decision that broke his heart but satisfied his cold political logic. He married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor. In 1811, the birth of his son, the King of Rome, seemed to secure the Bonaparte line, but the peace was a facade. To the east, Tsar Alexander, I was increasingly frustrated by the continental system's impact on the Russian economy. He began to drift away from the Tilsit alliance. Napoleon, convinced that only a decisive blow could force Russia back into his orbit, began assembling the largest military force the world had ever seen. Section 8, the Frozen Hell, the invasion of Russian Arena. In June 1812, the Grande Armée, a Babel of nations numbering over 600,000 men, crossed the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon envisioned a short, decisive campaign, a repeat of his previous triumphs. But the Russians had learned. Under the command of Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, they retreated deeper into the vast interior, employing a scorched earth policy. They burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and razed villages, leaving the French to advance through a wasteland. The summer heat was oppressive. Typhus and dysentery began to decimate the ranks before a single major battle was fought. The Russians finally stood their ground at the village of Borodino on September 7, 1812. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 70,000 men fell in a localized area of a few square miles. Napoleon, uncharacteristically cautious, refused to commit his imperial guard to clinch a total victory. The Russians retreated in good order, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered the ancient capital a week later, expecting a delegation of boyars to offer him the keys to the city. Instead, he found a ghost town. That night, Moscow began to burn. Saboteurs, acting on the orders of the city's governor, Rostopchin, set the wooden city ablaze. For 3 days, Napoleon watched from the Kremlin as his prize turned to ash. He waited for 5 weeks in the ruins of Moscow, sending letters to Alexander that went unanswered. "The weather is beautiful," he wrote to Paris, unaware that the Russian winter was gathering its strength. By the time he finally ordered the retreat on October 19, it was too late. The Grande Armée, weighed down by loot and hindered by thousands of non-combatants, crawled westward. Then the snow began to fall. The general winter had arrived. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Men froze in their sleep. Horses died by the thousands, forcing the abandonment of the artillery that was the backbone of French power. The retreat became a nightmare of survival. Cossacks harassed the flanks, picking off stragglers. At the crossing of the Beresina River, Only the heroic sacrifice of French engineers, who stood shoulder-deep in freezing water to build bridges, saved the remnant of the army from total annihilation. When the survivors finally crossed back into Poland in December, only about 30,000 of the original 600,000 remained. Napoleon had left the army ahead of the remnants, racing back to Paris to raise a new force, but the aura of his divinity was gone. Europe saw that the giant could bleed. Section 9. The Battle of Nations and the Fall of the Eagle Narrator. 1830 was the year of the War of Liberation. Encouraged by the Russian disaster, Prussia and Sweden joined Russia and Britain in the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon, displaying his incredible energy, managed to raise a new army of nearly 400,000 men, mostly young boys known as Marie-Louises. He won initial victories at Ulcer and Ulcer, but he lacked the cavalry to exploit them. His enemies had changed their strategy. The Trachenberg Plan dictated that the Allies would avoid direct battle with Napoleon himself, instead attacking his marshals. It worked. Slowly, the French were pushed back into Saxony. The climax came in October 1813 at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. It was the largest battle in European history prior to World War I, involving over 500,000 soldiers from across the continent. For 3 days, the French held their ground against overwhelming numbers, but the defection of the Saxon troops mid-battle and the premature blowing of a bridge across the Ulster River turned the retreat into a disaster. Napoleon was forced back across the Rhine. France was now alone, facing invasion from all sides. The campaign of 1814 is often cited by military historians as Napoleon's most brilliant. Fighting on French soil, he moved with the agility of his youth, winning a series of stunning tactical victories against separate Allied columns at Champollion, Montmirail, and Monterey. But the strategic situation was hopeless. Paris, defended by Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Marmont, surrendered while Napoleon was attempting a maneuver in the Allied rear. On April 6, 1814, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon's own marshals, led by Ney, confronted him. They refused to march on Paris, demanding his abdication. Napoleon attempted suicide by poison, but it had lost its potency. He survived to sign the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which exiled him to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. On April 20, he gave a heart-wrenching farewell to his old guard in the courtyard of the palace. "I could have continued the war for 3 years with you," he told them, "but I did not wish to see France unhappy." He kissed the eagle of the French standards, and as he departed for exile, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis Roman XVIII. The world believed the Napoleonic era was over. They were wrong. Section 10. The 100 Days and the Final Exile Narrator. For 10 months, Napoleon ruled Elba like a miniature empire, but he was bored and bankrupt. He watched as the Allies bickered at the Congress of Vienna, and as Louis Roman XVIII grew unpopular with a French public that missed the glory of the empire. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon slipped past British patrol ships and landed in France with 1,000 men. What followed was the flight of the eagle. As he marched toward Paris, the troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. At Grenoble, he stood before the 5th Regiment, bared his chest and cried, "If there is any among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers broke ranks and cheered, "Vive l'Empereur." He entered Paris without firing a shot. Louis Roman XVIII fled, but Europe would not accept his return. The Allies declared Napoleon an outlaw and formed the 7th Coalition. Napoleon knew he had to strike before their massive armies could unite. He surged into Belgium, aiming to split the British army under Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny, but failed to destroy them. On June 18, 1815, on a ridge near the village of Waterloo, the final drama unfolded. The ground was soaked from a night of torrential rain, delaying Napoleon's attack until late morning, a delay that proved fatal. The Battle of Waterloo was a close-run thing. as Wellington later called it. French infantry assaults were repulsed. Ney led a series of magnificent but unsupported cavalry charges against the British squares. Napoleon waited for his Marshal Grouchy to arrive, but instead it was the Prussians who emerged from the woods on his right flank. In a final, desperate gamble, Napoleon sent in his invincible middle guard. When they were forced back by the British guards, the cry, "The guard recoils," sent a shockwave through the French lines. The army broke. Napoleon fled back to Paris, where he was forced to abdicate a second time. He surrendered to the British, hoping for a quiet retirement in England. Instead, they sent him to the most remote place on Earth, St. Helena, a jagged volcanic rock in the South Atlantic. There, under the watchful eye of his jailer Hudson Lowe, Napoleon spent his final 6 years dictating his memoirs, carefully crafting the legend of the man who had brought the ideals of the revolution to the world. He died on May 5, 1821, likely of stomach cancer. His last words were France, "Elle armée, terre d'armée, ja c'est fait." In 1840, his remains were returned to Paris and interred in a magnificent sarcophagus at Les Invalides, where he remains today, a giant in the heart of the city he transformed. Conclusion narrator. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is more than a chronicle of battles and borders. It is the story of the birth of the modern world. When Napoleon was born, Europe was a patchwork of feudal states, ruled by divine right and ancient privilege. By the time he died, the seeds of nationalism, liberalism, and civil equality had been sown from the Atlantic to the Urals. His greatest legacy was not a victory on the field, but the code, Napoleon. This civil code replaced a chaotic mess of local laws with a unified, rational legal system that prioritized the equality of all male citizens before the law, the right to property, and the secularization of the state. It remains the foundation of the legal systems in dozens of nations today. Napoleon also standardized the metric system, established the lycées for education, and reorganized the central administration of France in a way that persists to this day. Even his enemies were forced to modernize to defeat him. Prussia's military reforms and the unification movements in Germany and Italy were direct reactions to the Napoleonic presence. He was a man of immense contradictions, a liberator who became a despot, a man of reason who was driven by a romantic, almost mystical sense of destiny, a champion of the people who crowned himself emperor. What lessons can we draw from the life of this man of destiny? He showed that talent, when coupled with relentless energy and ambition, could shatter the barriers of birth and class. He demonstrated the power of the human will to reshape reality. But his life also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of power. His hubris, the belief that he could dictate terms to nature itself in Russia or suppress the national will of the Spanish people, led to his nemesis. He once said, "The greater the man, the less he should have any will. He depends on events and circumstances." In the end, even Napoleon could not bend the world to his will forever. Today, Napoleon remains one of history's most debated figures. To some, he is the Corsican ogre, a warmonger who left millions dead in the pursuit of personal glory. To others, he is the Enlightenment on horseback, the tragic hero who tried to forge a united, meritocratic Europe. Regardless of the verdict, his footprint on history is indelible. From the boulevards of Paris to the legal codes of South America, we live in the world he helped build. As we conclude our journey through his life, we are reminded that history is not just a series of dates, but a drama of human ambition, genius, and the eternal struggle for a legacy that outlives the man. Outro, if this journey through history captivated you, make sure you subscribe to Chronicles of History. We publish new documentaries every week. Tell us in the comments below, what do you think was the single most decisive moment in this story? Was it the decision to invade Russia, or the failure to secure the sea at Trafalgar? And check out our other videos on screen right now for more epic history.